Hello and welcome to another episode of Aviation Analysis, the channel that investigates the greatest mysteries, tragic events and interesting stories related to aeroplanes and aeronautics. In today's video, we will be examining the strange case of the Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation propliner, which disappeared on March 16, 1962 over the Western Pacific Ocean. The flight had been chartered by the United States Army and was in the process of transporting 96 military passengers from Travis Air Force Base in California to Tan Son Nhut International Airport in Saigon, South Vietnam. However, disaster would strike not long after the aircraft stopped for refuelling at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. Whilst making its way towards Clark Air Base in the Philippines, the plane would simply vanish, with no warning signs or explanation. Despite one of the largest air and sea searches in aviation history, in the end, all 107 persons on board the doomed flight would be declared missing or presumed dead. If true, it is considered to be the second deadliest aircraft disappearance, behind Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. So, what happened that day in 1962? What was the flight's purpose and who was on board? What events transpired before and after the tragedy? And what mysteries remain? Join us on this brand new episode where we try to uncover what truly happened to Flight 739. It is worth stating from the outset that the cause of Flight 739's disappearance is still unresolved to this very day, which makes our understanding of its background and secrecy behind the mission itself even more pertinent. At the end of World War II, a group of mercenary pilots who conducted operations over China, called the American Volunteer Group, also known as the Flying Tigers, began their own transcontinental airline. In 1949, the Flying Tiger Line was approved. Their commercial all-cargo flights began in the United States, and by the mid-1960s the group were flying scheduled trans-Pacific all-cargo routes. According to Army historians, March 15, 1962 marked the first day of the Vietnam War. It was known that the United States were transporting equipment, technicians and advisors to the country in order to arm and strengthen government forces against the Viet Cong. The story of Flight 739 is widely believed to coincide with these operations, and so leads us to the missions that resulted in its disappearance. It all began around 3 AM when a cargo flight crash-landed on its approach to Adak Island Naval Air Station in Alaska. Cargo Flight 7816 was an L-1049H Super Constellation N6911C aircraft which was making a stop via Cold Bay Airport as part of a military air transport service (MATS) flights from Travis Air Force Base, California to its final destination of Kadena Air Base in Japan. Flight 7816's routing seemed normal as weather conditions were reported within minimum standards for the landing strip and visibility was relatively clear. However, for some reason a report would later determine the pilot seemingly misjudged his coordinates upon his approach to land. Thus, the Constellation crash landed 300 feet short of the runway itself. The landing gear was ripped from the underside, resulting in the craft flipping and skidding for more than 2,000 feet across the tarmac. Tragically, one of the 7 members on board lost their lives that morning. Less than an hour after Flight 7816 crashed, Flying Tiger Flight 739 was taking off from the US island territory of Guam, en route to Saigon via the Philippines. The second flight consisted of 96 passengers, 93 of whom were US soldiers who had advanced knowledge and experience in the more technical aspects of the Army, including in electronics and communications. 11 crew members were also on board. Interestingly, the remaining 3 passengers were Vietnamese service members, as well as Army Specialist Donald Sargent, whose niece, Jennifer Kirk, has been keeping her uncle's memory, and that of the flight itself, alive ever since. All she knows of her uncle's presence that day was that he was pulled back in on a special mission, handpicked by President John F. Kennedy. The aircraft was planned to make numerous refueling stops along its flight path towards Saigon, in Honolulu, Wake Island, the Coral Atoll on the Micronesia sub-region of the Pacific Ocean, Guam, and Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Despite a small maintenance delay, the flight departed Guam just before 9 p.m. on its westbound direction towards the Philippines with enough fuel for approximately 10 hours of flying time, according to an International Civil Aviation Organization (ICAO) accident report, which reviewed the incident. 2 hours after the plane took off from Guam, air traffic control was notified of its position by the pilot and given an ETA in the Philippines of 3 a.m. At the time, the aircraft was at a steady cruising altitude of 18,000 feet, with its coordinates being reported as being 13 degrees 40 minutes to the north and 140 degrees to the east. It was expected to reach the coordinates of 14 degrees to the north and 135 degrees to the east an hour later. That broadcast would never happen, as at 8:22 a.m. on March 16th, when the plane's fuel tank was expected to run out, Flight 739 was officially declared missing. With panic setting in and confusion spreading amongst those on the ground, an immediate search and rescue mission was scheduled to try and locate and assist the doomed flight. All measures were considered and equipment sourced to help rescue those on board, especially due to a call received from staff on board a Liberian tanker ship. The captain of SST L-1049 claimed that around 1:30 a.m. on the morning of March the 16th, he and his crew witnessed a mid-air explosion near the location of the last known broadcast of Flight 739. No one can deny the efforts of those involved in the search, as it was considered to be one of the largest searches ever recorded at the time, covering more than 200,000 square miles, more than 1,300 people, 48 aircraft and 8 ships were involved in the mission to locate the plane, a momentous task that totaled in excess of 3,417 flying hours. Investigations would later find that flight lines and ramp areas at the refuel stops were open to anyone desiring entry, including non-military aircraft, in an attempt to find the aircraft. Despite the 8-day search, Flight 739 was never found. As with any mysterious disappearances or downing of aircraft, there were many who naturally leapt the conspiracy theory narrative, that somehow the plane was sabotaged and deliberately wiped off the face of the earth. With regards to the explosion witnessed by the crew of the SST L-1049, they recalled that a vapor trail, or some phenomenon resembling one, was first observed, overheard and slightly to the north of the tanker and moving in the east to west direction, the subsequent ICAO report said. Statements by those on board claim that as the vapor trail passed behind a cloud, there occurred an explosion, with a white nucleus surrounded by a reddish-orange periphery with radial lines of identically coloured light. From it, 2 objects fell into the sea. If this was the case, what kind of aircraft, man-made or otherwise, could have struck the plane at this point, and what were the colours emitting from it? No one can conclusively say for sure. The ICAO reported in its findings that the aircraft was left unattended in a dimly lighted area for a period of time while at Guam. The possibility of tampering with the mechanics to deliberately bring the plane down added fuel to the fire with conspiracy theorists. Jennifer Kirk would recall the news of the flight's vanishing being delivered to her grandmother about her son's fate. A letter was delivered by a cab driver without any pre-warning from the Secretary of the Army, which stated the deep regret of her son's disappearance. This was followed a month later by a telegram signed by Major General J.C. Lambert, the Adjutant General of the US Army, which stated, "All reports of debris sighted were investigated, but nothing was found that could be remotely associated with the plane. Consequently, after a full review and consideration of all available evidence, it has been concluded that for an unknown reason, the plane plunged into the sea with all its passengers." And so, after all these years, the mystery surrounding those on board Flight 739 remains just that, a mystery. For the loved ones who lost their fathers, brothers, uncles and friends, the confusion, frustration and need for answers will always be present. closure seems out of reach for the families at this point. To add more stress and sadness to the situation, there was no military service proceedings conducted at the funeral, nor were the families presented with the traditional folded flag of the United States. Jennifer Kirk advised that her family payout for her uncle Donald was a mere $264. Sadly, their requests to have the men's names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. have also been denied, repeatedly, as the government considers the deaths to be outside of a combat zone. Unfortunately, the identities of the Vietnamese soldiers are still not known to this very day. Someone knows for sure they have never been revealed to the public for reasons which are not clear either. However, the American soldiers were finally identified and not part of any particular unit in the military, leading many investigators, historians and conspiracy theorists alike to believe they were specially selected for this particular mission. According to the 1963 Civil Aeronautics Board crash report, the men were mainly highly trained electronics and communications specialists, something which leads many to believe that they were involved in an extremely covert, intelligence-based tactic, such as wiretapping or reconnaissance work. Propaganda, misinformation, and control of state media is a crucial weapon when it comes to war. The spreading of disinformation to the general public is not uncommon and can lead to widespread confusion, panic, and revolt. Therefore, it is very plausible to assume that the men were heading into the conflict with the intention of conducting undercover espionage for the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. One of the specialists on board Flight 739 convinced his mother that he was heading to Vietnam to film a training film. This was officially reinforced by a letter that was dispatched to her son from his commanding officer at the Film Library Division. Eerily, the men who boarded the flight that morning were fully aware of the dangers of the mysterious mission, many of whom were convinced that they would never return to their loved ones. A few asked that their wives and children be taken care of in the event of their demise. Jane Wendell East recalls her father, Sergeant First Class John Wendell, saying, "I won't be back from this," before setting off on the secret operation. Something was not right about Flight 739 before it even took off by the looks of things. Jennifer Kirk also discusses the day her uncle left for Travis Air Force Base on a CNN interview, stating, "He just kept coming up to his sister-in-law saying, 'I just need one more hug before I go. I just need one more hug.'" As the plane was chartered from a civilian company, the US government and military continued to deny any knowledge of its disappearance and fate. Historians have tried on several occasions to request and dissect documents from the Army, Air Force, Defense Department, National Archives, State Department and CIA, yet all lead to more questions than answers. Luckily, on May 15th, 2021, the families gathered in Columbia Falls, Maine, to unveil the first memorial to the flight donated by Morrill Worcester, founder of Wreaths Across America, a non-profit organisation that helps fund and organise wreath laying on veterans' graves around the world. So, what was the final word on the disappearance and potential cause of Flight 739? Officials with the Flying Tiger Line commented on the possibility of kidnapping and/or sabotage, that such theories would be conceivable had the subsequent investigations confirmed that an explosion had occurred at some point during the flight path. The Executive Vice President of Operations said that there was nothing powerful enough on board the plane which could have blown it apart, and that something violent must have happened. The CAB believe and concluded that, based on the observations of the tanker crew members, that the flight most likely exploded in mid-air, the accident report concluded. A summation of all relevant factors tends to indicate that the aircraft was destroyed in flight. However, due to the lack of any substantiating evidence, the board is unable to state with any degree of certainty the exact fate of number 6921C. And so we come to the end of today's episode, folks. We hope you enjoyed this one and that we were able to educate and shed light on one of the greatest aviation mysteries of all time, one that many have never heard before. We live in a world where espionage, propaganda, and mysterious disappearances go hand in hand. Social media, mainstream news, and government information can often blur the lines between what is real and what is fake. If you haven't heard of Flight 739 before, perhaps this was the plan all along. Take care, and we'll see you next time.